Tough act to follow there, but a great, great act. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, worshiping with you here. And particularly, I want to recall last Sunday afternoon when many of us were here celebrating Reverend Maurice's installation in this church. So it was a joy to be here as part of that celebration. I found it to be an event filled with stories and examples of practicing peace and justice, both within her life and within this congregation. Many of you in this congregation have a long tradition of Christian ministries for peace and justice, and that will go on. Violence and conflict are issues facing each one of us daily. Millions of people around the world much more severely than those of us sitting here. Each of us must learn to be people for just peace, or using other language, peace with justice, or shalom, or salam, being peacemakers and peacekeepers. So these words and phrases are used interchangeably, but are important wherever we live and work, study, and play. Each religious tradition has begun with a very strong desire and a strong element of teachings and works for peace and justice. Nevertheless, many religious groups over thousands of years have fought wars and used violence, and many lives have been destroyed and are continuing to be destroyed this very day in the name of different, conflicting religious beliefs. Although I am well aware of violence and destruction of human life by religious groups, I still choose to teach and practice the positive values in support of peace and the elimination of violence, wars, and injustice. We begin with God and the highest values of our about spiritual being. We always need to realize that we differ among ourselves as to what we think about the nature and the purpose of God, what is the will of God, and how it can be practiced. And this is true within each local church, as well as within and among the people of the world. We always need to make room and allow for all types of interpretations of the will and nature of God. With all my heart and soul, I believe that God seeks peace and unity among all the people and all the creatures, including unicorns, of this earth. God calls us to be open and affirming of diverse ideas, backgrounds, and all ways of life. Your words of welcome in this church to include everyone, to be a totally inclusive church, are ways by which you show that commitment. Our task as human beings is then to discover the ways that God leads us and follow in those ways towards unity among all creation. Peace with justice begins with prayer. We need to pray for peace and understanding every day of our lives. We need to teach children the ways of peace. Peace and justice does not happen by accident or by chance or by the luck of the Irish. It happens as the result of integrity, security, compassion, goodwill, understanding, motivation, and long, patient, hard work by people who seek peace and justice in every part of our lives and the world. We must give our time and energy and resources that peace and justice, shalom, salam, can grow and thrive. A reflective study of the Holy Scriptures of each major world religion reveals valuable religious teachings about how to develop and maintain peace and justice within ourselves and in the world. We can learn from the lives and teachings of Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, Jesus of Nazareth, Muhammad, Buddha, and other religious leaders throughout the ages and into the present. God regularly points us to the places in our communities, our nation, and our world where people are being treated with less than justice, mercy, and love. When we speak of obedience to God, we speak of the burdens of our wider human family, as well as of the people of our immediate family and our immediate neighborhood. To obey God does not mean only to pray the right prayers, attend and worship as part of a congregation, or even to be a good person. It means that we work to ensure that all of God's children everywhere are treated as persons and individuals with dignity and worth. Each one of us learns how to be a person of peace and justice in our own home, our family, by our parents and family and those who are surrogate family, by our teachers and mentors in school and society. I want to share within this message some of the examples from my childhood and youth that then are part of my story of how I became one who seeks to be a person for peace and justice. I recall vividly how my own parents taught me how to think and speak with love and respect for everyone, and also not to use violence or think violence toward anyone or any creature. They taught me how to respect people who were different from me and all the wonderful varieties and benefits of diversity and inclusiveness. In my childhood home, and I hope in yours, we learn to learn from everyone. I learned personally that each person has goodness and positive values, especially those who were different from me. I learned within my home how to speak kindly and passionately about others and towards others. I learned these values in my religious education and worship experiences from the study of the scriptures, including the one that we heard this morning about faith without works is dead. I learned these values from many group experiences within the church and within the communities around me. So in response to my family, my church school, my public school education regarding justice and peace, and my experiences all of my life as an adult, I've always sought to live a life of love and caring for others, and always sought to transform myself and improve myself in respect and appreciation for people of different backgrounds. For me, as I look back over the years of my life, I have been particularly glad that I have been one who has been led in this way by others. All of my life, as with us, each of us, is a learning experience in becoming persons of peace, a peacemaker, in obedience to the will of God, and as a member of the human family. In 1956, before the start of the civil rights movement, I was a high school student in New Jersey, living in an interracial neighborhood. My social conscience really developed strongly developed in my high school years, as I learned about prejudice, discrimination, and racism. For a major term paper in high school, I gathered information about discriminatory practices of mortgage lending institutions, real estate agencies, and communities in northern New Jersey, where I was living. I prepared as my term paper a sociological survey of questions and went door to door visiting the white and African American families living in my immediate neighborhood. These very personal and social issues grounded me in my continued desire to eliminate all forms of isms. They've been a part of my entire life journey, but it started as a student in my own community. I believe that each of us can remember individuals and experiences which have taught us the importance of peaceful and just relations with other people. In my own life journey, those most important have included all of the major biblical figures and the stories, and then those figures and stories throughout Christian history. Most formative for me have been Francis of Assisi, Alfred Nobel, Father Dominique Peer, Father Thomas Merton, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., May Reed Corrigan and Betty Williams, Dr. Albert Schweitzer, Nelson Mandela, Dag Hammarskjöld, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, John Paul II, Pope Francis, and leaders within the United Nations and people around the world. Each of you can also think of those people in your life who have been inspiring and guiding you in understanding the importance of peace and justice. For more than 50 years, I have studied and spoken often about the lives and thoughts of the men and women who have received the Nobel Peace Prize. And then out of my own Christian tradition, I've also valued and been transformed by the examples and the teachings of Buddha, Mahatma Gandhi, and the Dalai Lama. When I was 12, I began reading about the humanitarian and medical mission work of Dr. Albert Schweitzer in Africa. Through high school, I continued to deepen my reflection on his philosophy of reverence for life, affirming and respecting all life, and the ethical responsibility that we have for every living creature. In 1955, as a high school freshman, I made with my family my first trip to Europe and learned firsthand by that journey and my observations, going back to places that had been very much involved during the Second World War, just 10 years earlier, and many places that had seen conflict. I saw firsthand, still there, the results of the devastation of war. Our family trip was just 10 years after the end of World War II. Evidence of the war was there in every place we traveled throughout Europe. And this is where I first developed my concern to be a worker for peace and justice. One of my high school research papers was about the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. 10 years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I was living in New Jersey, right across the Hudson from Manhattan and the United Nations, so I was able to go to the UN at that time and begin my research about nuclear energy. At that time, it was only known that it was used for terrible destruction. But I reported in that term paper upon the research I'd learned at the UN and from other agencies in New York, and the early proposals, just beginning, of how nuclear energy could be used for power, how a nuclear reactor works was a literal part of my paper, about the medical uses and the potentials of both detection and treatment of nuclear energy, which now, in our time, is commonplace. All of us have been involved in the benefits of nuclear power in medicine. Also, as a high school student, I began to study and give talks about the lives of many of the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. This had begun because Dr. Schweitzer was one of those recipients who I first learned about in the 7th grade. In 1970, I gave my first talk about the 3 women who had received the Nobel Peace Prize. At that time, only 3 women, since 1901, had received the Peace Prize. This last Monday, I spoke at Springfield College and told the stories of 17 women who now have received the Nobel Peace Prize. So the story goes on, their stories go on, and I continue to grow and learn about looking at the lives of others. Since high school, I've written regularly and spoken regularly about the risk of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, as well as into the last few weeks with articles that I've written. When I've gone to the United Nations, it's often been to attend meetings and learn about the United Nations. The last 2 years, I've been representing the United Church of Christ, attending the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which is one of the oldest commissions of the UN, and spent an entire week each year learning and meeting with women from around the world in what they are doing to further peace. There was a time when I served 2 churches in succession in southeastern Connecticut. Our church and our community were located near the Navy submarine base, where most of our nuclear fleet of submarines was being deployed, and also on the same river, the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics, where the submarines were built and still are being built. Many of the members of my church, those 2 churches at that place, were either serving in the Navy, retired from the Navy, or were in private employment in the defense industry. And I learned how to balance the pastoral care for those families in my congregation and the families who were in those professions and occupations with the need to be able to develop nonviolence into the future. So I was involved in many peaceful marches and vigils right across from both the Electric Boat Division and from the Navy submarine base. So this meant that I was able to realize that one can be a Christian, be supporting the need for defense, but also the need to have diplomacy, and realize that every one of us have stories that are complicated that can involve us working in places where we may prefer to be doing something else. It led to many conversations and opportunities to be a peacemaker within the congregation, within the community, but still stand firm for peace and justice. Since 1965, I've made 4 important educational trips to Israel and Palestine to meet and study with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish leaders and groups. Over those years, I've seen the devastation grow about the occupation of the military of the Israeli government in Palestine territories, Gaza and the West Bank. In recent years, major setbacks have continued. They're still continuing even more so in the very last weeks for peace in the Middle East and in that region. And I continue to be involved and supportive of agencies and people who work to try to bring about reconciliation in that part of the world so that peace can prevail for Palestinians and for Israeli citizens. Always, always, the benefits of reconciliation and cooperation outweigh the tragedies of violence and conflict. To become a peacemaker and a peacekeeper means for each of us knowing what we are willing to live for and to die for. To be completely human, we need to understand our own purpose, the meaning for our own lives. Our Christian faith and teachings help us identify and put into practice our goals and our vision to fulfill our human purpose, both as individuals, as Christians, and within the human family. When we work together to build better selves and better families and communities, we are also building a better world for others. We need always to break down the barriers and the obstacles that keep us apart from others in order to become one with God and one with all creatures on this earth. As individuals and as a church, we need to continue to think, pray, talk, and act about peacekeeping and peacemaking in our families, in our communities, in our state, in the nation, and all over this planet. So it is, my friends, that we must continue to work to overcome hunger and disease, ignorance and hatred, prejudice and discrimination, poverty and illiteracy, tyranny and injustice. To achieve peace and justice will not happen because others are doing their job. It will happen because we are doing our job as obedient servants of the will of God. We have no choice, give our time and our energy, our resources and our prayers, our faith and our works, that peace and justice will occur. This is part of the meaning of the hymns that we've been singing today. It's part of the meaning of the United Church of Christ statement of faith, which declares, quote, God calls us into his church to accept the cost and joy of discipleship, to be his servants in the service of all people. May each of you be blessed as you continue in your stories and in your journeys to be peacemakers and peacekeepers. Amen.